Okay, so we are going to ask Vicky Everett and Chris Havranek to join us. The luxurious. He is Chris. Oh, there he is. All right.
I'm going to turn on my camera and hope that my virtual background is going to obscure the closet that I'm sitting in.
Is it blurring out my face?
Yeah, it's blurring out everything. That's crazy. You're tiny. Oh, it worked, Vicky. It looks so
Let's
good.
see.
Hey! Chris, we can see your body. It's like you're in the witness protection program.
It's intentional. That wasn't an accident, though. I'll go full unblurred. It's just gonna be a big mess.
Like I am, and now it's out.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Cool. Good to join y'all.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks to Kronk and Brand for the last segment. Welcome, Vicky and Chris, everyone. Welcome them. Vicky and Chris, would you mind introducing yourselves, your role at the lab? Vicky, go ahead, and then we'll go to Chris.
And I'm going to try my best to ignore chat so that I don't get distracted like a dog looking at a squirrel. Hello, I'm Vicky Edwards. I'm our head of player experience here at Undead Labs. That my team is responsible for a whole bunch of stuff, but we essentially have two main objectives. One, to make sure all of the player touch points that they have with us as a studio are smooth. So like customer support, community, marketing, all of those things. And then the other thing is making sure that we get information from our players and from their behavior and from their wants and hopes and dreams. And we get that information to developers so that they can make informed, creative choices when they're building the game. So it covers a big breadth of things, like I mentioned, customer support and community, but also insights and user research and accessibility, which we're talking about today.
Accessibility as well, yeah. Looks like, thank you so much. And also, best manager ever.
Well, shucks, you have to say that.
Twisted my arm. No, it's so true. So fun to work on the player experience team. Rohan agrees. Best ever. Yes. Chris, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Hey. Yeah, so I've been at the studio for a couple of years now. Started on State of Decay 2 as a UX designer over there. I'm now on State of Decay 3 as a product owner. And one of my big focuses is accessibility, being the accessibility champ, kind of a liaison between the studio and Microsoft or Xbox. So yeah, I've been doing that for a couple of years now and having a good time. Vicky was also my manager at one point, and I agree, best manager.
Guys, my head, I'm not going to be able to get out of this tiny closet by the time this is over.
No, it's so true. And the first person that ever introduced me to the whole kind of field of accessibility. You know, I came from very small studios previously. They're very, I think the first job that I had before started with 8 people, and I was one of the 8. And then we grew from there, but we never grew, I think, past like 30 people. And so that just, it wasn't something that I was exposed to. So when I came to Undead Labs and we started talking about accessibility, that was a massive eye-opener for me. And it just expanded my world and made me just thoughtful about, all of our players, and it made me grateful for learning what I didn't know. So hopefully we're going to have that experience here a little bit today. I just have a kickoff question for you both. And that is, how did you first get interested in accessibility in the field? That could just be how you first learned about it. What was your first experience with accessibility in games?
Who wants to go first? Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go. So it was in my previous job, I was at a different game studio, and accessibility was already something that we were definitely looking at. And I was fortunate enough to be at a studio that had like a full user research department that was also helping me push that forward for my specific team. But one thing that really sold it, and like sold it for the team as well, was we had a player who was either blind or had low vision and used a screen reader. And when she was trying to navigate the product that we were working on, it was very clear. She sent a video of like, oh, okay, well, my screen reader is going from this object, then this one, and then skipping down there, and it was going all over the place, not like a screen reader should be acting. So it was very difficult, if not impossible, to actually use the product. And that was something that definitely brought empathy to the team in terms of like, oh, okay, well, this is something that we need to focus on, because this is a very clear instance of like a show and tell of like, wow, this is not a product that works for everybody. And that was something that kind of brought the team together. And then that was our first point of like, hey, we need to improve how the screen reader works in this specific screen. And then it turned into, well, how do we make it work better for deaf or hard of hearing players or people with motor issues or anything along those lines. So it was definitely something that made it more impactful when you can actually see the result of not building something that's that accessible.
Right. Seeing how, we say this a lot, is like seeing how the, players actually interact with it, and then being like, oh, they're using it like this. Let's make that better.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally. It's so funny. My experience is almost the exact same as yours, Chris, except it wasn't in game. So I've worked at Undead Labs twice. I worked here for a couple of years on Moonrise, which we talked about a little bit earlier, our wonderful, but sadly didn't make it mobile game. And after that game was over, I wanted to take a break from games, and I went and I worked at a tech startup that we were making software for other developers to make software. So it was a very different field. And I was a UX designer at that company, and my boss at the time said, "Hey, we want to get our product out into federal agencies, and in order to do that, we have to be accessibility compliant. You're an empathetic person. I want you to head this up." And I was like, "What does that even mean? Like, I don't know what what do you mean?" I'd heard about accessibility, but I didn't know anything about it, and I felt really uncomfortable being put in charge of it because I just didn't know anything. And so I went to a meetup at Microsoft, an accessibility meetup. And at that meetup, there was an engineer who was blind, and he was doing a demo of how he writes code. And he was using a tool that could have been the tool that I was working on. It wasn't. And using a screen reader and showing us how he relies on very reliable tabbed navigation to get around in the software. And I'm actually getting chills talking about it right now. It was so eye-opening and it lit such a fire under my butt of this entire population of users that I had never even thought about as an option for somebody who might use something that I'm designing. And it was extremely humbling and embarrassing to have never considered people that might use things in a very different way and what they might rely on. And I had this moment at the software company of why aren't we talking about this for games more? We never talked about accessibility in my previous game jobs. And so when I came back to Undead Labs, it was really important for me that accessibility be a thing that I was allowed to push forward. And it's been welcomed with open arms. We have so many people in the studio who are excited to learn more about accessibility, to make our game more accessible to more players, because that means more people get to enjoy the things we're working so hard on. But yeah, it was that very similar, oh my God, watching somebody struggle to interact with something is just it's so powerful. And I think we've been trying to replicate that a little bit, and we'll talk more about some things we've been doing at the studio, but we've been trying to replicate that empathy aha moment for people as we've been trying to grow in accessibility at the studio.
Yeah, those aha moments. And I mean, calling out your shirt, gaming is for everyone. And feel like that is kind of the thing that opened up in my brain, just like you were saying. It's wait a second, how do we make this all players to be inclusive of everyone, to have their own good time? So, and that leads into the question that you just touched on. What are some things that are happening at the lab? How do we approach accessibility? What kind of things are we doing to live this value, essentially?
Well, we've got a few things kind of a suite of things. It ranges from really small efforts to slightly bigger things, and small things like knowledge sharing in Slack. We have a really lovely engaged community of, I'd call them accessibility advocates at the studio, who when they see a news article that is relevant to the work that we're doing, they'll share it. They'll ping people who it might be relevant to. oh, have you seen what Forza is doing with sign language? Or like, oh, well, here's the latest of what Last of Us 2 has done. Like sharing that so that we're all up to speed on like what's happening in the industry has been really valuable. We also we're so lucky to be part of the Xbox family because they have a champs program for accessibility. And Chris mentioned earlier that he's our accessibility champ. And Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about that program and kind of how it's been?
Yeah, it's really nifty just with how many studios are under Xbox's umbrella. It's a way for me to keep in touch with both Xbox as like the main, I guess, entity, and their accessibility department, but then also all the various other studios like Bethesda, the Coalition, and whatnot, and talk to them about like, hey, how this is a problem that we're seeing with like we're playtesting something and we don't really know how to solve for like motion sickness or something like that. Like, how did you do that? Oh, okay, we could go reach out to someone at Rare and talk to them about like how they solve for motion sickness on Sea of Thieves or something like that. So it's a great way to just learn how other teams are doing things and not just be stuck in our little bubble about how we're doing it.
Totally. And you mentioned motion sickness. It reminded me that I'm one of our studio's, I think, most reliable motion sickness test dummies. I get motion sickness within I'll tell you within 10 seconds if something is going to make me feel sick for hours and hours. But that's another thing, like tapping your internal resources that I think a lot of times we forget that, it's like 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people have some form of a disability. And
Yep.
people all throughout the studio experience things totally differently than somebody else might. So just kind of tapping what we've got internally is really helpful too. Another thing that we've done 2 of these, is something called an inclusive design workshop. And
Just about to
we
touch
did.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Sam, do you want to?
No. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about keeping this in touch with the studios, this is something that's been so valuable about like coming into the Xbox family, is just also getting these types of resources to be able to have the time. Sometimes when you're in a scrappy startup company, it's really difficult to be like, we're going to take 3 days and not make the game that's going to keep us paid, and when we have the Xbox family, it's like giving us this breathing room to take that time to be thoughtful, to consider our full audience. So Vicky, you put together these inclusive design sprints, and I participated in the first one. Chris, I think were you in both? You were in the second one.
The second one, yeah.
The second one. So and that was open to all the developers at Undead Labs. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was and how it runs?
Yeah, well, to a little bit of background. So while I was taking my break from games and learning about accessibility, I was introduced by somebody on the accessibility team at Xbox to, I'm going to share a link in the chat, to this resource, this inclusive design resource from Microsoft. And it's like Inclusive Design 101, like little tips and tricks for how to bring people into your design process. And I learned about this outside of games. When I came back to games, I was like, I want to do this. How do we do this? And when I came back, luckily, we got acquired by Microsoft in that little window when I was gone. And so I reached out to the Xbox research team and asked them if this is something that we could do, because I'd heard they had been doing workshops with other teams. And they were like, oh, we don't do those anymore for games because there wasn't any interest. And so I just kept asking for I don't know, every month, is there a team that we could maybe pull together to do something? And so they pulled together a special, a bespoke team just for us to run one of these. And what it was is it's a 2-day workshop. Actually, I think our first one was 3 days because we were doing it for State of Decay 2 and State of Decay 3. And it's a 2-day workshop. And on day 1, we bring in 4 accessibility advisors, each of whom has a different disability. So somebody with mobility issues, and they're all gamers, a gamer who is blind, a gamer who is deaf, and a gamer with cognitive issues. And we spend the whole day interviewing them, not about necessarily their experiences with our game, but just their experiences playing games in general and what it's like being a gamer with that disability. And we learned so much. We learned, I think my hope was that the people that participated in that would also have those little aha spark moments. And I think we were totally successful, because out of that first inclusive design workshop or sprint, we got a ton of ideas for things that we could do for in the future for State of Decay 3, but also like right now for State of Decay 2, which was still live and we were still making updates for. I can talk about some of those updates. Should I talk about some of those?
Maybe we should, because it might tie into something. Because people might not think of like some of the updates that we did as necessarily being accessible. Because the thing is, it's something that is maybe an accessibility feature is also just good for everyone, or or good for a vast majority of people. Green Zone. I'm a proud Green Zone player.
I love Green Zone, and Green Zone came directly out of our conversations with our accessibility advisors about just wanting different, not like wanting the game to necessarily be easy, but just wanting to be able to customize different areas of difficulty in different ways. And so Green Zone and difficulty sliders, I think both came out of our conversations from that first workshop, which totally benefits so many people.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example of just like accessible by design, where to your point, it's not like, oh, this is an accessibility feature because of X, Y, or Z reason. But another example being like, if we want to communicate that you're taking damage or zombies taking damage, just trying to make sure that we're communicating that through multiple modes of communication. So visual, you can see the character taking damage. You can see like something in the HUD maybe. Audio, you can hear yourself taking damage or zombies taking damage. Haptic, if you're using a controller, you can feel that. So just looking at ways to make sure that we're communicating anything in the game in multiple ways rather than just something that's visually on the screen and no other affordance for that.
Yeah. In our second workshop, we talked with a gamer who is deaf, and he taught us about this vest. It's called a Woozer Edge vest. It's a rumble vest, basically, that he uses when he plays games. And we immediately messaged our finance guy, like during our conversation with this advisor, just like, can we have money? Can we buy a couple of these? He's like, yes, do it right away. And so we have 2 of those. We've got, we're like beefing up our accessibility testing kit that we have in the studio so that we can test these things as we're developing them and make sure that, they pass our first pass of like, yeah, this feels like this might work right. And then we can bring an expert in and tell us if it actually is kind of going to fit their needs.
That's awesome. So at Undead Labs, we have what's called an accessibility champ. Can you tell us a little bit about the champ and what they do?
Yeah, what's the day-to-day look like for being a champ, Chris?
By the way, Chris is our champ.
Day to day, it's mostly keeping in contact with Tara Volker, our that head of accessibility that talks with all of the different studios at Microsoft or Xbox. And then also just making sure I'm keeping tabs on all the various features that are getting built in State of Decay 2 or State of Decay 3, and just keeping an eye on hey, is this something that is getting designed in a way that might cause friction for someone that has motor control issues or someone that's blind or low vision, and what can we do to help mitigate that? So is it something that, again, can we just design it in a way that makes sense for everybody, or is it something that we need to have a feature specifically for to turn on and off or modify that way? So a lot of it does come to just making sure I'm keeping tabs on what's going on in both our games and making sure that the team is consistently thinking about that. And one of the things that we're striving for too is as we're thinking of new things to put in the game, either one, from the very start, we think of okay, how are we communicating this? How do we communicate a critical hit or something like that? Or is this something that can work really well for someone that is hard of hearing, but maybe has some issues for someone that is blind, for example? And then if it is something that we can't really wrap our heads around and how do we solve for this, then that's me reaching out to Xbox and the other studios to see if they've had to solve a similar problem, or maybe that's something that we need to collaborate on together.
One thing that's been really cool in Chris, you being a champ and being so closely tied with Tara, is how I feel like Tara kind of looks out for us and is like, hey, this other studio did this thing. Do you think that's something you guys might want to do? For example, we just released this might seem small when I explain it, but I'll explain why it's not small. A web page on the State of Decay 2 website, and I'll share a link right now that shows.
I just grabbed the link too.
that shows all of the accessibility options in State of Decay 2. And if you look at this and you're very familiar with our settings, you might notice that it doesn't map one-to-one with how settings are organized in game. And other studios have been doing this. And the reason why it's so important, and we heard this in both of our inclusive design workshops, is that oftentimes people with disabilities have severely limited incomes. They don't have a ton of cash to spend on a game that is going to be so important to them and have it not actually be playable for them. And so having information ahead of time before they like spend their time or their money on investing in a game, and knowing before they jump in if they can actually play it, is super important. And Tara pointed out a couple of other studios that had done this, and we're like, oh yeah, why don't we absolutely have to do this? And so we put this out, and it's organized in a way that somebody who isn't familiar with the game yet would be able to easily find, like, oh yeah, there's that thing that it's going to make this game playable for me. It might not necessarily be under the accessibility section in the settings, but at least maybe this will help, at least even just if it helps one person, it's totally worth the time that we spent on it. But this is on our webpage, and also we updated our Steam description. So just sharing more information before somebody actually invests their time, that's super important to us. And I think kind of speaks to how our relationship that we're trying to maintain with our community. We want to help our players out as much as we can.
100%. Yeah, all our players. Thank you so much for this overview, and I'll drop that link again in a little bit, but we have a video to show, and so I was thinking, since we're having some sharing issues, Vicky, you mentioned we could probably put it in the chat, and I thought, well, we could do the little trivia question for the audience, and while those answers as those start rolling in, then let's drop the video in, and then everyone, I think what we're probably going to say is, play on the video when you see it hit chat. It's about a 5-minute video. We can also post this a little bit later, probably next week. If you guys want to see it, it is on our website, but because it's very easy to drop here, but this is a video about the inclusive design sprint and hearing from the devs about what they learned, and hearing from the accessibility champs about how we make things better for all players.
Do you want me to drop it in after people have been sharing their trivia answers? I don't want to step on.
Let's go ahead and do that just for timing's sake. So First of all, so for audience, for your chance to win a hard copy of the anniversary zine, here is your question. And there are 2 possible correct answers. We'll accept either one. No bonus points if you get both, other than well done for paying attention. And the question is, what major update, or 2, was developed in response to our inclusive design sprint? We touched on them both today. So again, first 10 or so correct answers goes into a random picker, and then Megan or Rohan will be reaching out to let you know you have won. Appreciate there's a number in there, but give us the name. Not just the number of the update, but that I appreciate.
I love that someone knows that which update that came out in. That's so great.
La Coalición has a good question. He says also Fields of View update, right? Right. Not exactly a major update, but 100%.
And that was for especially for motion sickies like me, that's a huge, being able to adjust field of view is just really important.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's the update that we released the scalable subtitles with as well, which you would think they just make the subtitles a little bit bigger. That's easy. With how State of Decay 2 was built, that actually was a very tricky task, but we had a really clever engineer that was able to figure out, and it was kind of a pet project, and we ran with it and turned it into a full-fledged feature.
So awesome.
That's awesome. Okay, well, while mods are contacting, and I'll shout out a winner when we get one. Let's see that video if you are ready. Drop it in chat, and then folks can play. Yes, sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
No, just a caveat. This is from 2020, so pre-pandemic, and the baby that I'm growing in this video is now 3 years old and runs our entire household. So. A little bit of inside scoop.
very easy to design from an ivory tower and to develop from an ivory tower. I imagine someone who's deaf will embrace this feature. But if you never ask someone who's deaf, if you never actually have them try it, you're sort of not really designing to the audience themselves, because they might go, actually, what you're doing here might superficially address my needs, but actually doesn't, I never play like this, and so I would never benefit from this feature.
We have someone here named Vicky that is very passionate about making our product and games in general more accessible. She's had the opportunity to work with Microsoft in order to bring people in and work with them.
As soon as I heard that this was a thing that we could do, I jumped on it. It just felt like the next step in our evolution as game developers.
People with disabilities do have a voice that have to be at the table from the beginning, and that's why you're all here today, is to include that. But the other responsibility...
We run through a series of exercises about accessibility and inclusivity and how that impacts game design. And then we bring in some outside people as consultants, and we encourage them to discuss their accessibility and disability issues with us.
If I want to aim, I have it set up to where I just say aim, and it presses right click, so then it toggles to aim.
That's something we would benefit from, but we cannot afford. And a lot of deaf people are on government assistance, and they don't have the money to get things like that.
If I want to go around a corner, I have to do this with my thumb.
I have young onset Parkinson's disease, which provides a lot of motor challenges that other gamers don't usually have to deal with.
A lot of people online rely on mics to coordinate things in multiplayer games, and I can't really use a microphone with them. So that's a little bit awkward sometimes, and there's a little bit of a disconnect between me and other people.
Being able to save their usable vision for playing the game and then having something like text-to-speech really offset that and have it so they don't have to read as much text. So like if I was...
I really needed to sit down with people who had lived these experiences so that I could find out from them, you know, like, sure, I can make subtitles bigger, but that doesn't really get at all of the details of what it's like to be struggling to read subtitles while a million things are going on at a time.
Give the player like a simple option somewhere that basically prevents most of the complicated camera behaviors we have.
The ability to have a slider that lets you highlight that even more if you need like a bigger stroke around it.
Being on a team with your collaborators, like coming up with ideas and refining ideas and throwing things out and being so open, you know, there's no no's, it's only like maybes and what ifs.
It still feels like the core of how our game works, and it's creating interesting opportunities.
It's like, well, if it stands out, that's actually good because it's got a higher contrast.
For the sake of accessibility, people can still make those changes to those basic controls.
I think people got to feel proud of the ways in which they could contribute and solve a problem that a real human that they got to meet has experienced.
One of the priorities that came out of our discussions later on, we were like, we really want to have good subtitles and captioning. I was actually able to go back to my desk and type up a rough spec, and like we're already developing guidelines for our subtitles.
What this inclusive design sprint is helping us do is try to change our culture as a studio so that the next time we start a brand new game, we can start at the ground floor with all of these accessibility issues in mind.
We were able to kind of go back and assess what was wrong with 2 and like kind of where we made mistakes or dropped the ball or just like weren't aggressive enough. It gives us the option to like learn from that and just do much better on the next project.
Everyone has a right to experience games, just like everyone has the right to experience the movies, or fly in an airplane, or brush their teeth. A lot of people don't see the disabled community in the same light as they do, unfortunately, and so video games is just that same kind of industry that we're trying to break into.
Finding ways to make sure that we can celebrate the value of our players and just say, like, you can be a gamer and you can bring this to the community of gamers, then you should, and we should enable it.
It feels like it's an upward, trajectory. There's been so many changes just through this process. To see so many people at the company really engaged and excited about it has been really valuable, and it makes me happy.
I see in the future this ripple effect happening. If we can just have a few people kind of set the standard for the rest of the industry, I think everybody's just going to kind of follow suit. It's going to become a trend, and it's a really good trend.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Chris, for being here. Super appreciate it. Thanks for sharing more about accessibility in our game, and to our audience, thank you for the feedback and helping us continually craft the best game for everyone that we can.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thanks for
having us,
hosting.
everybody.
So everyone say goodbye to Vicky and Chris. Woo! Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your Friday.